Oh, wonderful. Perfect. So I wasn't really expecting you guys to be around here this early. So not going to lie, for the presentation, I haven't really got myself ready yet. So, well, if you want to come along, you can watch me get ready, I guess. It won't be that weird, but, you know, give and take, I guess. It is 2021. So, here. We'll clean up here and then come along. So anyway, my presentation for the end of the year here, as you might have heard throughout class and such, is going to be on Rhodesia. Now, Rhodesia has a long and storied history, generally beginning around 1888 when Cecil Rhodes, a British imperialist, bought the mineral rights to the land, right above South Africa. So it's an interesting beginning, as it started as a private venture, kind of, almost in a similar way as the Congo, with, it wasn't a Belgian colony, it was rather the sole possession of King Leopold II. Kind of similar, not exactly the same, but close enough. So, the colony, it expanded from there in the same way that just about any other land within Africa other than Ethiopia and kind of Liberia carried on, that being a very powerful and rich white minority which ruled over a more or less subjugated black majority. So it existed in this way. Rhodesia was considered to be a successful part of the British Empire. As decolonization carried on and frustrated efforts going into the 50s and 60s, things started to change. South Africa had gained independence from Great Britain. Great Britain was dropping colonies like hot potatoes. Not only were they expensive, but there was also a greater social idea of right and wrong. So as I kind of touched on before, this project is going to focus on specifically the Rhodesian Bush War, which was a 15-and-a-half-year conflict that went from the mid-60s to the late 70s. The reason why this presentation is such a narrow topic is just because, like, we're talking about international law and human rights abuses and those ideas, and to focus on the entire history of a European colony in Africa, like, I could just read word for word an entire exact history of the country, right? Like, it's full of abuses. It's full of what modern international law would deem to be illegal. So I've decided, again, to focus on a specific point in time, that being the Bush War. I think an important thing to note, and the reason why I really wanted to focus on this for the presentation, is because it's a hard topic to talk about. And it's a hard topic to talk about specifically because it's not black and white. Like, literally, it's not a black and white conflict. So, again, it's hard to talk about because it might initially sound like I'm trying to defend the white minority government of Rhodesia, but that's not the case. It's a lot more complicated than that. In fact, the vast majority of Rhodesian security forces were black in the first place. Their most elite unit was 95% black, and they went out of their way to join that unit. So obviously, looking at this, there's something a lot more complicated than we kind of collectively as a society choose to remember about the Rhodesian Bush War. And in my experience with history, when you hit complication, you lose interest. When you hit complication, you replace actually trying to get to the meat and potatoes of the situation with just simplicity. And I think that's a shame. And that's why I'm doing my presentation on the Rhodesian Bush War. So now that I'm cleaned up and the introduction's done, let's head on down to the Learning Center and I'll finish up this presentation. Thanks, Matt. So, welcome to our Learning Center. As you can see, we are solar powered because we are men of the future. But anyway, let me take you back and we can do some learning. So, come along. So, just like any situation that we're looking at with international law and war, as we've talked about time and time again in class, it's a big gray area. There's no one example necessarily of things being completely just or completely justified or something being completely wrong, because we're dealing with two different factions with two different ways of thinking, two different goals, two different objectives, and with any situation such as the Rhodesian Bush War, hundreds and thousands of people. For example, a great example of this is there was a unit within the Rhodesian security forces called the Celis Scouts. They numbered about 500 or so people. About 80% of those people were black Rhodesians who volunteered to sign up. They spent a lot of time behind enemy lines, stirring up chaos, a lot like the partisans that we looked at and such, whether it be in Italy. We discussed Italian partisans during the Second World War, or French partisans, or Russian, same old, same old. And one day, 85 of them raided an enemy camp. And the UN determined that this camp was actually a refugee camp. So already you think that, if an enemy unit were to raid a refugee camp that was designated as such by the UN, that's probably problematic, right? There's something wrong there. Breaking international law, perhaps. But they did not care. The 85 scouts of this Rhodesian unit raided the camp with a number of trucks, and they got right into the middle of the camp, and they opened up. They just completely opened up. Those 85 men, according to some, they killed over 1,000 enemy soldiers, though, because it was determined after the fact that even though this was a refugee camp as seen by the UN, it wasn't actually. It was a camp used by the enemy forces, of course, of Rhodesia, as a staging ground for further attacks into Rhodesia. So you're already dealing with a huge gray area. Who's in the right here? Does Rhodesia, a state that many Western states don't want to see exist any longer because it is, again, a white minority-ruled government, what side do you take, right? Do you even have to take a side? It's worth further discussion, I think. This is going to be one of those presentations where it's more, you're left with more questions than answers. Because that is one thing I've learned throughout this entire course is just, you don't have answers. A lot of these situations, they don't come with clear-cut understandings of the way things ought to be. You're rather just stuck 30 years in the future, 40, 50, 60 years in the future, trying to determine exactly what happened. I guess so you can try to ensure they don't happen again, but perhaps that's a little bit too optimistic. I'm unsure. So at the same time, we have to make sure that words are also not minced. Even though there is a gray area that existed within Rhodesia during the 60s and 70s, it was still a state run by white supremacists with the goal of keeping white supremacy alive within Rhodesia. So, like, even Ian Smith was the leader of Rhodesia when he was disposed. Originally, this is where you get into some iffy who supported who, what was going on in Rhodesia. Originally, his government, when Rhodesia broke off from Great Britain, he wanted to run it as in a similar fashion as South Africa. So you still have like the apartheid state and such, but Britain didn't want that to happen. So they enforced that there should be elections held, and at the end of that long election period dealing with democracy and stuff, it was decided that Ian Smith would form a government with a black minister. Though that black minister, that arrangement, which was accepted by Great Britain and accepted by a lot of the people within Rhodesia as well, was not accepted by radical, or what you might call radical, black groups within Rhodesia at the time. Namely, Robert Mugabe. He did not like that prospect at all, which reignited conflict all throughout Central Africa. So eventually Ian Smith, boom, he's out of the door. And he moved away because obviously you'd think that the now new state of Zimbabwe, which is what Rhodesia now is, didn't take too kindly to himself or his government. The conversation shifted once the Cold War died down and people were able to reflect on what occurred over the past 60 years. Around the year 2000, Ian Smith, he was called into question. Robert Mugabe and his government in Zimbabwe wanted to hold him accountable for crimes, and he relished this opportunity because, of course, during the leadership in Zimbabwe accused the leadership of Rhodesia of mass war crimes, the killing of innocent civilians, rape and pillage, and the like. But at the same time, the ex-government of Rhodesia, Ian Smith, he accused the other side of the exact same thing, which opens up a whole new can of worms when looking at an issue such as this in terms of international law. Ian Smith, for example, he discussed how the Shona massacred tons of another tribe within Rhodesia at the time, and he couldn't do anything to stop it. Or when he did do something to stop it, that's now remembered as a massacre, when in reality, Ian Smith said, Rhodesia was suppressing terrorists. But not just terrorists against the white state, but terrorists against the people the white state were trying to protect, he says. Because Robert Mugabe and other black revolutionaries were guilty in the Rhodesian Bush War. They did bad things to innocent people. That doesn't justify the actions of Ian Smith and the Rhodesians, though. Again, Ian Smith, he ran on a campaign. What's it? He ran on a campaign for a whiter, brighter Rhodesia, his government said. So there can be no denying the issues surrounding the white government in Rhodesia. No matter what war Ian Smith and Rhodesia was fighting, sure, they could have been fighting against terrorists. Sure, those terrorists could have been killing innocent civilians. But what's the message of those terrorists? They are trying to dispose of a racist, white supremacist regime. So you're going to have to draw a line in the sand, I guess, as the casual learner of this situation. You're going to have to choose at what point do these freedom fighters turn into terrorists? Where does the bad of these actions outweigh the good that the Rhodesian government's trying to uphold? Another interesting aspect of Rhodesia as well is you can look at if their army is 70% black Rhodesians, you can look at that as almost supporting the Rhodesian effort. Well, if so many people were to join up, it can't be that bad, right? Well, we also have to look into instances like what were these people put under? What propaganda made them join up to fight with the Rhodesians anyway? When you're immersed in just a brutal culture, when you're immersed in propaganda demonizing your enemy, you're probably going to get swept up in that. So is that what happened to these Africans who fought for Rhodesia? Chances are yes. Rhodesian propaganda campaigns were well known and very effective in their efforts. On a whole other note, if we want to talk about just war crimes as well, which is pretty much what this class is all about at the end of the day, the Rhodesians also used chemical warfare. Well after, again, this isn't the 1890s where all things are a little bit like, ooh, maybe we can get away with this. No, this was the 60s and 70s. They used anthrax to murder cattle, so the cattle couldn't be used by the opposing forces. They seemed to starve them out. A tactic probably gathered from the British during the Boer War. When you're fighting on these vast African plains, you have to find a way around that. And one way around that is just starve out your enemy. Whether they be your enemy or whether they be innocent civilians as well who just get caught in the crossfire. It would be hellish. The Rhodesian use of chemical weapons expands further than that as well. Rhodesia was well known for doing anything to win. In the 70s, they were facing such heavy economic sanctions and criticism worldwide that they were out on their own. They were using old equipment. They were trying to smuggle stuff in from South Africa. They were fighting a desperate war to keep this white supremacy government alive. And in doing that, a tactic would be poisoning, is that the right word? Poisoning clothes, covering clothes in toxic chemicals, and using double agents, getting them into terrorist camps. So across borders, where they'd be training these liberation groups, they'd get all these clothes that actually secretly came from Rhodesia, and they were just covered in toxins. And that would eventually, of course, cause severe health problems. But some of these clothes didn't end up with terrorists. They would end up all over the... it's like when you put a landmine in a field. You could blow up a military target, or in 50 years, you could blow a kid's leg off. There's not a lot of responsibility with cases such as that. I mean, we're even putting aside the fact that it's poison. Like that is so far in the realm of illegal, it's not even funny. But it's still just irresponsible regardless. Also, regardless of whose side is who, and the fact that it's a little bit more gray than we think it ought to be, a point to be remembered as well is today Rhodesia, the memory of Rhodesia, is taken up by right wing. Jesus. My R's and W's, man. Right-wing extremists they've taken up that cause. They uphold Rhodesia as this shining example that the world let down. So maybe that also speaks to the situation in reality as well. Anyway. Of course, sources for things I've said will be provided. And there can be a more in-depth discussion if that's wanted. But I really wanted to use this situation just to highlight how one, situations such as Rhodesia should be discussed. It's hard because both sides are guilty of something. And we don't like to talk about that sometimes. We don't like to talk about Allied war crimes during the Second World War because the Allies were the good guys, right? So... sometimes these things are hard to talk about, and sometimes it's easy to get shut down while talking about these because you don't want to hear about the good guys maybe having some bad in them. But humanity isn't perfect, right? Even the most just of causes can be filled with problematic circumstances, and they got to be talked about. Rhodesia isn't talked about at all. Finding sources for this, like actual academic sources, was difficult. Most of the sources I found came from the Rhodesian government themselves. And I don't think that speaks to people trying to uphold their memory or anything like that. I think that speaks to just the world wanting to forget. And that's problematic because there's so many things that we can talk about in here and discuss and apply to other situations as historians. The value in these situations people don't want to talk about is immense. but they're lost. So, in saying that, I guess, thanks for coming along. Hope you had a good time. Hope you learned something. And yeah, challenge things. Read. Investigate. Dig deeper into situations where there is not a lot of material on, because there is something there. Maybe not something that somebody wants hidden, but maybe something that we collectively want to forget. And I don't think that should be the case. We should remember everything in one way or another. So, yeah, no, happy Easter. Enjoy the rest of COVID. You know, hopefully this goes swimmingly. Who knows? 2021's off to a roaring start, so why not keep it going that way, I guess. But anyway, yeah, no, thanks. Bye. See ya. Be like a waving montage. Yeah, you can pan. Just wave. Pan out into the woods. Into the lovely cedar trees.